just like to make the point that we're very fortunate that His Majesty has allowed us to use Buckingham Palace for this event.
Princess Anne opened a red velvet box inside Buckingham Palace, and according to those in the room, Queen Camilla was on her feet before anyone even saw what was inside. What was supposed to be a quiet birthday for Princess Charlotte turned into the moment that allegedly split the royal family in two. So what was in that box? And why did Anne choose this exact day to open it? Stay with this one, because the ending changes everything you thought you knew about how this family actually works. The Grand Hall was lit gold that afternoon, every seat arranged by someone who clearly knew which royals needed distance from each other. Charlotte stood at the front in white, 11 years old, aware that something bigger than a birthday was happening, but not yet sure what. Anne walked in already certain of what she was about to do. She waited for the room to quiet, then announced she was giving Charlotte something no one expected, an honorary title carrying her grandmother Diana's name. Not about rank, she said, about spirit, about compassion, courage, and refusing comfort while others suffered. Then she lifted the lid. The tiara inside threw light across the ceiling, and for a few seconds, nobody in the room said a word. Catherine's hand tightened around William's. King Charles sat still, unreadable. And Camilla, according to guests present that day, rose so fast her chair scraped against the floor. Her voice cut through the applause before it could finish. She called the decision unacceptable. She said Anne had no authority to act alone, that the tiara belonged to no one in Charlotte's generation, and then, allegedly, the line everyone in that room had been bracing for, that Diana was gone and the family needed to stop dragging up the past. Nobody moved. Anne didn't even blink. She looked back at Camilla with the calm of someone who had been expecting this exact reaction for 6 months. A small, controlled expression crossed her face, one that almost nobody caught, because it wasn't relief, it was confirmation. Charlotte tugged her sleeve and whispered, had she done something wrong? Anne knelt down and told her, without hesitation, that her grandmother would be proud of her in this exact moment. By the time the family left that hall, headlines were already forming outside the gates. But nobody watching yet understood the ceremony wasn't the actual story. It was the final scene. The real story had been building for 6 months, in a basement in Surrey, in quiet meetings nobody was supposed to know about, and it was about to come out. Here's how it started. Months earlier, Anne had been reviewing Royal Archive records and noticed something odd. Files that were confirmed to exist in 1998, then in 2005, then again as late as 2012, simply weren't there anymore. No transfer log, no storage note. Just gaps where documents used to sit. What was missing wasn't paperwork. It was Diana's letters to her sons, photographs from the landmine walks, from the AIDS wards, from years when simply sitting beside those patients was considered a political risk inside the palace. Personal jewelry from her charity years. Private diaries. Individually, each missing item could be explained. Together, spanning nearly 2 decades, the pattern told a different story. So Anne went looking for someone who might know why. She found Robert, a former butler who had worked closely with Diana for over a decade, and met him privately outside London, away from staff and cameras. He was in his 70s by then, and he told Anne he had debated for years whether to say anything at all. What he described, according to his own account, was a slow and deliberate removal of Diana's personal belongings that allegedly began shortly after her 1996 divorce and accelerated sharply following her death in 1997. Items taken quietly, overnight. Staff who had once been close to Diana reassigned or pushed toward early retirement, with explanations that shifted depending on who was asking. Some were reportedly told their careers and their family's comfort depended on staying quiet. Robert had kept that silence for nearly 30 years. But by the time he sat across from Anne, he said he couldn't carry it any longer. Anne drove home that night, understanding this wasn't neglect or careless record-keeping. It looked intentional, designed to quietly shrink Diana from a woman the public adored into a brief, uncomfortable chapter the family had simply moved past. But one man's memory, however sincere, wasn't proof. She needed something undeniable. That something was sitting in a locked safe in Surrey. Edward Langford had worked in the palace archives until 2008 and had quietly retired soon after. When Anne arrived at his home on a stormy night, he didn't waste time explaining. He opened the safe and showed her everything: retrieval logs, item inventories, internal memos, and written instructions for disposal, all dated, all organized, all pointing to a clear chain of decisions rather than a single mistake. Then he showed her the recording. Back in 2005, sensing something was wrong, Edward had carried a small recorder into an internal meeting. What played through Anne's laptop that night was a woman's voice, steady and certain: dispose of everything connected to Diana, leave nothing behind that could remind the public of her, and treat it as a direct order. The voice, Edward said, belonged to Camilla, recorded the same year she married Charles. Anne sat without speaking for a long moment. She carried the documents to her car through the rain, fully aware that 6 months of quiet effort had just become something she could no longer sit on. The only question left was how to bring it forward without it disappearing before the right people ever heard it, because somebody else was already starting to notice. Camilla, according to palace insiders, had sensed for weeks that Anne was digging. She didn't know how much had been found, but she knew enough to act. Within 48 hours, every remaining digital trace linking the archive system to Diana's missing items was reportedly wiped. She believed the loop was closed. Quiet calls were also made to former staff, worded carefully, reminding them what silence had protected for years. For some, that was enough to keep them quiet again. A fallback story was allegedly prepared too, ready to place the blame on a former secretary who had left the palace over a decade earlier and had since passed away, someone conveniently unable to defend himself. It was fast, it was thorough, and it targeted records that no longer mattered, because Edward's copies had been sitting in Surrey for years, untouched, in a safe nobody in Camilla's circle knew existed. With the proof secure, only one thing remained: what would happen the moment the rest of the family heard it for themselves? 3 weeks after the birthday, Charles called a private meeting. Immediate family only, no staff, no public record. Anne brought the folder she had built over 6 months and set it down without a word. Then she played the recording. Camilla's voice from 2005 filled the room, the instruction, the phrasing about leaving nothing behind, the words, "This is an order." Whatever composure Camilla had walked in with didn't survive hearing it played back. She tried to explain it away, called it a misunderstanding, said she had only been protecting the family, that people were reading too much into it. Anne answered with documents, retrieval records, dated memos, statements gathered over months. Every gap her prepared explanation needed to work had already been closed before she opened her mouth. Charles listened without interrupting. When he finally spoke, according to those familiar with the meeting, his tone was quiet, almost tired, the voice of someone reconsidering years of what he thought he understood. He said she had gone too far. The matter was kept private, but the consequences were real. Camilla was reportedly moved to a separate wing of the palace, her official duties paused indefinitely, and the staff involved quietly reassigned elsewhere. But correcting one chapter of the record was never really the point. After the room cleared, Anne stood alone by the window. She hadn't done any of this for satisfaction, and she didn't feel much of it now. Just the weight of having asked people to risk things they had protected for decades. William found her there and told her what she already knew, that she'd been right, and that being right had come at a cost. Somewhere in the palace, Charlotte was still 11, still wearing a title and a tiara tying her to a grandmother she never met. She didn't yet understand everything that had happened around her birthday. But she would, eventually, learn the full story of a woman who walked through active minefields and sat beside AIDS patients when almost nobody else would, because she believed closeness to suffering mattered more than distance from it. That was what Anne had really placed inside that box, not jewelry. Proof that the truth had survived every attempt to bury it. So why go to such lengths to erase her in the first place? Because the past doesn't stay quiet just because someone wants it to. Every tribute to Diana became an unspoken comparison. Every anniversary reopened the same headlines. If acceptance was ever the goal, the real obstacle was never a title, it was a memory that refused to fade, and erasing it quietly seemed easier than competing with it directly. But memory doesn't work that way. The more she seemed to disappear from the official record, the tighter people held on. Documentaries multiplied, book sales climbed. An entire generation who never met her became fascinated by a woman they were told had changed the monarchy forever. In the end, every attempt to erase Diana only made her harder to forget. Was Anne's decision the most courageous thing this family has done in years? Or did it cost a unity the family may need far longer to rebuild than the wound it was meant to expose? Tell us what you think in the comments. Like this video, share it with someone who follows the royal family closely, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.